The ballroom at Hartwell House blazed with candlelight, each flame reflected in the polished mirrors that lined the walls, creating the illusion of an endless golden space. Ladies in silk gowns moved like pale moths through the warm air, their jewels catching the light, their laughter rising and falling like music. It was Christmas Eve, and the finest families of 3 counties had gathered beneath the ancient oak beams to celebrate the season. Yet Alexander Grenville, 6th Duke of Ravensmore, stood apart from it all, one shoulder against a marble pillar, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, watching the scene before him with the detached observation of a man who had long ago decided that such gatherings held nothing for him but duty. He was 32, though some said his eyes were older, tall, dark-haired, with features that might have been called handsome, had they not been so often arranged in expressions of cool assessment. He possessed the kind of presence that made conversation falter when he entered a room. His estates were vast, his fortune considerable, his bloodline impeccable. London hostesses pursued him relentlessly, presenting their daughters like offerings at an altar. But Alexander had learned to deflect such attentions with practiced courtesy that discouraged without quite offending. He had no intention of marrying. He had seen what marriage could do, had watched his own mother wither under the weight of his father's cold indifference, had heard her crying in the night when she thought no one listened. He would not inflict such a fate on another, nor would he risk discovering that he possessed the same capacity for cruelty that had made his father a tyrant. The music swelled, a waltz beginning, and Alexander prepared to retreat to the card-room when he saw her. She stood near the French doors that opened onto the terrace, half turned away from the crowd, looking out at the dark gardens beyond. Her gown was ivory silk, simpler than the elaborate confections worn by most of the other ladies, and her dark hair was dressed without excessive ornament. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her mouth too wide, her bearing too self-possessed, but there was something in the line of her neck, the straightness of her spine, the stillness with which she held herself that arrested his attention completely. He did not recognize her, which was unusual. Alexander made it his business to know the principal families, if only to avoid unwanted entanglements. "That is Miss Eleanor Ashworth," a voice said beside him, and Alexander turned to find his host, Lord Hartwell, smiling with the knowing expression of a man who believes he has caught someone in a moment of interest. She arrived only yesterday with her aunt, Lady Pemberton. Her father was Sir William Ashworth, died 3 years ago, leaving her quite comfortably provided for, though not extravagantly so. She has been travelling abroad, I understand, but has returned for Christmas. A sensible young woman, from what I have observed, not given to the usual silly chatter. Alexander made a non-committal sound, but he found his gaze returning to the woman by the doors. As he watched, a young gentleman approached her, bowing, clearly requesting a dance. She smiled. It transformed her face entirely, warming it, bringing light to her grey eyes, and placed her hand on the gentleman's arm. They moved toward the dance floor, and Alexander felt an entirely irrational irritation that she had accepted so readily. He dismissed the feeling immediately. It was of no consequence to him whom Miss Eleanor Ashworth chose to dance with. The evening progressed. Alexander fulfilled his social obligations with his usual reserved efficiency, dancing with his hostess and 2 other ladies of appropriate rank, conversing about the weather and the Christmas festivities with the minimum engagement required by courtesy. Yet, throughout it all, he was aware of where she was, Miss Ashworth, with her quiet grace and her occasional bright smile that seemed to come from some place of genuine warmth rather than practiced flirtation. She danced several times, spoke with various guests, and never once looked in his direction. This too irritated him, though he could not have said why. It was near midnight when circumstance brought them into proximity. Alexander had stepped onto the terrace for air, finding the ballroom oppressively warm, and discovered her there already, standing at the stone balustrade, her shawl wrapped close against the December cold. She did not turn at his approach, but he knew she had heard him by the slight stiffening of her shoulders. "Forgive me," he said, his voice formal. "I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude." "You have not," she replied, and her voice surprised him. It was low, composed, with an undertone of something he could not quite identify. "The terrace is large enough for 2 people. Seeking escape." He moved to stand several feet from her, maintaining proper distance, looking out at the frost-silvered gardens. "You find the gathering oppressive, then?" "I find that I have been away from England long enough that such events require a certain readjustment." She glanced at him then, and in the moonlight her eyes were very clear. "And you, Your Grace? What sends you into the cold?" So she knew who he was. Of course she did. "I am not fond of crowds," he said, which was true, though not the whole truth. He was not fond of the falsity that crowds required, the endless performance of interest in matters that held no real significance. "That must make your position rather difficult," she observed, and there was something in her tone, not mockery precisely, but a dry awareness that suggested she understood exactly what she was saying. "A duke who dislikes society. How do you manage?" No one spoke to him this way. Most people were either intimidated by his rank or calculating in their friendliness, hoping for advantage. This woman seemed neither impressed nor interested in cultivating his favor. It should have relieved him. Instead, he found it intriguing. "I do what is necessary," he said. "I fulfill my obligations. Beyond that, I am not required to enjoy it." A remarkably honest answer. She turned to face him fully, and he could see that she was studying him with the same careful observation he had directed at her earlier. "Most people in your position would have offered some platitude about duty and honor, making all sacrifices worthwhile. Would you have believed such a platitude?" "No." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "But I have found that people rarely concern themselves with whether they are believed, only with whether they have said what is expected of them." Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a small crack in the careful armor he had constructed over the years. This woman, with her direct gaze and her refusal to perform the usual social games, was dangerous in a way he had not anticipated. "You are very frank, Miss Ashworth. I have found that life is too short for elaborate pretense, Your Grace. My father taught me that honesty, delivered with kindness, is a greater courtesy than pretty lies." Her expression softened slightly. "He was a scholar, and not much suited to society himself. I suppose I am my father's daughter in that regard." Before Alexander could respond, the sound of laughter drifted from the ballroom, followed by the beginning of another dance. Miss Ashworth gathered her shawl more closely. "I should return," she said. "My aunt will worry if I am absent too long. She is convinced that the night air is mortally dangerous to unmarried ladies." "Then I shall not keep you." Alexander bowed, correct and formal, but as she moved to pass him, he found himself speaking again. "Miss Ashworth, I wonder if you might honor me with a dance tomorrow evening. There is to be another gathering, I understand." She paused, looking at him with an expression he could not read. For a moment, he thought she would refuse, and he was surprised by how much he wanted her to accept. "I am not certain that would be wise, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I have heard that you do not often dance, and I should not wish to begin rumors by being the exception." "Let me concern myself with rumors," he said, and was startled to hear something almost urgent in his own voice. "One dance. Miss Ashworth, surely that cannot do any harm." She held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw something, a flash of understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the peculiar connection that had formed between them in these few minutes of conversation. Then she smiled, that transforming smile that warmed her entire face. "Very well, Your Grace. One dance." She returned to the ballroom, leaving him alone on the terrace with the cold night and the unexpected feeling that something significant had just occurred, though he could not have said precisely what. He remained there for some time, staring at the gardens without seeing them, aware that his careful equilibrium had been disturbed and uncertain whether he wished to restore it. Inside, the music played on and the candles burned, and Christmas approached with all its promises of joy and redemption that Alexander had long ago ceased to believe in. Yet as he finally turned to go back inside, he found himself thinking of grey eyes and honest words, of a woman who had looked at him and seen not a duke but simply a man who disliked crowds. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it had been years since anyone had seen him at all. Christmas morning dawned grey and cold, with frost coating every surface, and the promise of snow heavy in the air. Alexander woke early, as was his habit, and lay for a moment in the massive four-poster bed that had belonged to 7 generations of Ravensmoor dukes before him, staring at the canopy above and thinking of his father. Charles Grenville, 5th Duke of Ravensmore, had died 4 years ago, collapsing in his study after a particularly vicious argument with Alexander about the management of the estates. The physicians had called it apoplexy. Alexander had called it inevitable. A man could not live his entire life in a state of controlled rage without it consuming him eventually. What no one knew, what Alexander had never spoken of to any living soul, was that in those final moments, as his father had clutched at his chest and his face had darkened with pain, Alexander had felt nothing. No sorrow, no fear, no relief. Just a vast emptiness, a cold void where emotion should have been. He had summoned the doctors, had made the necessary arrangements, had stood through the funeral with appropriate gravity, and all the while he had wondered if perhaps his father's greatest success had been transforming his only son into exactly what he himself had been, a man incapable of genuine feeling. The thought had terrified him then. It terrified him still. He rose and dressed with the help of his valet, choosing dark colors as always, and descended to the breakfast room where Lord Hartwell's guests were gathering. The room was warm and bright, filled with conversation and laughter, and Alexander took his usual seat near the window, accepting coffee and toast and retreating into the morning newspapers. He was reading an account of some political matter in London when he became aware of a presence beside him. He looked up to find Miss Ashworth standing there, dressed in a deep green gown that brought out the colour in her eyes, a book tucked under one arm. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all." He rose, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please join me." She settled herself with unconscious grace, accepting coffee from a footman and regarding Alexander with that same direct gaze that had unsettled him the previous evening. "I thought you might wish to know that I have not forgotten my promise," she said. "One dance this evening. I am a woman of my word. I never doubted it." Alexander found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the slight shadows beneath them that suggested she too had slept poorly. "You are an early riser. I find that I do my best thinking in the morning hours before the demands of the day intrude." She opened her book, and he saw that it was a volume of poetry. Wordsworth, he thought, though he could not be certain from this distance. "I was hoping to find a quiet corner to read before the others descended, but it appears I was not early enough." "The library is empty," Alexander said, surprising himself. "I passed it on my way down. If you prefer solitude, you would find it there." She looked at him with something like amusement. "And yet here you are, in the breakfast room with a dozen other guests, when you yourself prefer solitude. Shall I assume that you too are performing duty rather than following inclination?" He felt that crack widen slightly, the armor weakening. "You see a great deal, Miss Ashworth." "I observe," she corrected gently. "There is a difference. I spent many years traveling with my father, watching people in cities and villages across Europe. One learns to read what is unspoken, particularly when one does not always speak the language." "And what do you read in me?" It was a dangerous question, far too personal for a casual breakfast conversation, but he found he genuinely wanted to know. She was silent for a moment, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "I see a man who has learned to protect himself by appearing invulnerable," she said finally, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "I see someone who has been hurt, though I cannot guess how, and who has decided that the safest course is not to feel at all. I see loneliness, Your Grace, though you wear it like armor." Alexander felt as though she had reached across the table and struck him. No one had ever spoken to him with such direct perception, such unflinching honesty. He should have been offended. Instead, he felt something close to relief, the relief of being truly seen after years of invisibility. "You are dangerously perceptive, Miss Ashworth. I apologize if I have overstepped." But she did not sound particularly apologetic, and her eyes remained steady on his. "You need not answer me. I have a terrible habit of speaking my thoughts too freely. My aunt despairs of me." "I would not wish you to be other than you are," Alexander said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "Honesty is rare. I find it valuable." They sat in silence for a moment, and it was not uncomfortable. Around them, the breakfast room filled with more guests, conversations growing louder, but Alexander was aware only of the woman across from him, of the way the morning light touched her dark hair, of the slight smile that curved her mouth as she opened her book. "May I ask what brought you back to England?" he said finally. "After so long abroad?" Her smile faded slightly. "My aunt requested it. She is growing older, and she wished for family near her. I am her only close relation, and I could not refuse her." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her book. "And perhaps I was ready to come home. One can wander for only so long before the wandering becomes its own kind of prison." "You believe that? Returning represents freedom." "I believe that running from pain does not make it disappear," she said quietly. "It only makes it a companion that travels with you. Better, perhaps, to stand still and face it." Alexander thought of his own running. Not physical, but emotional. The way he had retreated into coldness and control after his father's death, telling himself it was strength when it was truly cowardice. And if what you face destroys you, then at least you will have had the courage to face it. She met his eyes again, and in hers he saw a deep understanding that spoke of her own battles, her own losses. "I would rather be destroyed by truth than preserved by lies, Your Grace." Before he could respond, Lady Hartwell swept into the room, declaring that they must all prepare for the Christmas service at the village church, that carriages would depart within the hour, that everyone must dress warmly for the cold. The moment between them fractured, and Miss Ashworth rose, excusing herself with quiet courtesy. Alexander watched her go, aware that something fundamental had shifted in him during their brief conversation. She had seen through his carefully constructed defenses as though they were made of glass, and rather than using that knowledge to flatter or manipulate, she had simply acknowledged it and moved on. It was this lack of agenda, this simple honesty, that drew him to her with a force he had not anticipated and did not entirely welcome. The church service was a trial. Alexander sat in the Ravensmore pew, ancient and ornate, listening to the vicar speak of love and redemption and the gift of Christ to a fallen world, and felt nothing but the familiar emptiness. He had attended such services all his life, had mouthed the prayers and sung the hymns, but the words had never touched him. They spoke of a God who loved unconditionally, who forgave without limit, who saw the heart and not merely the appearance, and Alexander could not reconcile such a God with the world he knew, a world where his father had crushed his mother's spirit and called it marriage, where wealth and rank mattered more than character, where a man could live his entire life without once being truly known by another soul. He was aware of Miss Ashworth several pews ahead beside her aunt. She sang the hymns in a clear, true voice, and when the vicar spoke of the shepherds finding peace in the presence of the infant Christ, Alexander saw her bow her head slightly, as though the words had touched something in her. He envied her that capacity for belief, even as he knew it was forever beyond his reach. After the service, the guests gathered in the churchyard, admiring the ancient tombstones and exchanging Christmas greetings. Alexander stood apart as usual, but found himself watching as Miss Ashworth paused beside a small grave, very old, the stone weathered almost smooth. She stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the cold marble, her expression unutterably sad. He approached without conscious decision, drawn by that sorrow in her face. "Someone you knew?" he asked quietly. She looked up, startled, then shook her head. "No, only a child who died very young. You can just make out the dates. 1798. She would have been only 5 years old." Her voice was soft. "I always pause at children's graves. It seems wrong that they should be forgotten simply because they lived so briefly." Alexander looked at the worn stone, at the faint outline of a lamb carved at its top. "You have a tender heart, Miss Ashworth." "I have a heart that knows loss," she corrected, her grey eyes meeting his. "My mother died when I was very young, and my father never recovered from it. He was a kind man, a good man, but there was always a sadness in him, a place she had occupied that remained empty after she left. I think that is why he travelled so much. He was looking for something to fill that emptiness, though he never found it." "And did you," Alexander asked, "find what you were looking for?" She smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of knowledge. "I learned that some emptiness cannot be filled, Your Grace. One can only learn to live with it, to make it part of oneself, rather than fighting against it constantly." She turned from the grave, wrapping her shawl more tightly against the cold. That is a kind of peace, I suppose, though not the kind the vicar speaks of. They walked back toward the carriages together, not touching, maintaining proper distance, but Alexander was intensely aware of her presence beside him. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he too lived with an emptiness that nothing could fill, that her words had illuminated something in him that he had never been able to articulate. But the words would not come. He had spent too many years in silence to break it easily. "This evening," he said instead, as they reached her carriage, "you will remember our dance?" "I will remember," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that eased something in his chest. "I find I am looking forward to it, Your Grace." She departed, leaving him standing in the churchyard, aware that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he too was looking forward to something. It was a small feeling, fragile and uncertain, but it was there nonetheless, a tiny flame against the vast cold of his customary existence. That evening he dressed with unusual care, though he told himself it meant nothing. That evening he descended to the ballroom with something that might almost have been anticipation, and when the music began and he crossed the floor to where Miss Eleanor Ashworth stood waiting, he knew that he was standing at a precipice, that one more step would send him into territory from which there might be no return. He took that step anyway. He offered his hand, and she placed hers in it, and they began to dance. The waltz was torture of the most exquisite kind. Alexander had danced countless times before. It was expected of his position, but he had never been truly present for any of it. The movements were mechanical, the required conversations banal, the entire exercise a performance he endured with practiced indifference. This was different. Every point of contact between them seemed to burn with awareness, her hand in his palm resting carefully at her waist, the measured distance between them that suddenly felt both too great and not nearly great enough. They moved through the figures in silence at first, and Alexander found himself acutely conscious of everything about her, the way she held herself with natural grace, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the steadiness of her grey eyes as she looked at him. She did not simper or bat her lashes, or employ any of the calculated arts he had observed in countless other young ladies. She simply danced and met his gaze, and seemed entirely comfortable in the silence that stretched between them. "You dance well," he said finally, because some comment seemed required. "My father believed that a lady should be accomplished in the social graces, even if she did not particularly enjoy them," she replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I spent a great many hours with a dancing master in Florence, who despaired of my tendency toward independent thought." Independent thought is incompatible with dancing? He felt that a lady should simply follow where she is led, without questioning the direction. Her eyes glinted with subtle humor. "I have never been particularly skilled at following without question." Alexander felt the corner of his mouth lift, an expression so unfamiliar it almost startled him. "I imagine that must have tried his patience considerably." "It tried my father's patience as well on occasion, though he loved me for it nonetheless." Her expression softened with memory. "He used to say that I had my mother's spirit, uncompromising and true. I think he found comfort in that, even when it made life more difficult." They turned, and Alexander caught sight of them in one of the great mirrors lining the ballroom. A tall, dark man in evening blacks, and a woman in ivory silk, moving together with a harmony that seemed to belie everything he knew about himself. For a moment, he could almost believe that he was capable of this, of connection, of genuine feeling, of something beyond the cold emptiness that had defined him for so long. Then the waltz ended, and the moment shattered. A young man approached immediately, Mr. Thomas Fairfax, second son of an earl, handsome and charming in the easy way of men who had never known hardship or doubt. Alexander knew him slightly. Fairfax was pleasant enough, though given to excessive enthusiasm and a tendency to speak without thinking. "Miss Ashworth," Fairfax said, bowing with exaggerated gallantry, "I have been hoping for the honor of a dance all evening. Might I claim the next? Unless His Grace has secured your entire card." He smiled at Alexander with the casual presumption of social equality, apparently unaware that he was bordering on impropriety. Eleanor glanced at Alexander, something questioning in her eyes, but he had already stepped back, his face settling into its customary cool mask. "I would not presume to monopolize Miss Ashworth's time," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Fairfax, she is all yours." He bowed and withdrew before she could respond, moving to the edge of the ballroom where he could observe without being observed. He told himself it was merely courtesy, that he had no claim on her time, that it would be selfish and presumptuous to expect her to dance with him alone. He told himself that the tightness in his chest meant nothing, that the way Fairfax made her laugh was of no consequence to him whatsoever. He told himself many things, and believed none of them. The evening progressed with agonizing slowness. Alexander watched as Eleanor danced with Fairfax, then with Lord Hartwell's nephew, then with a visiting baronet from Shropshire. She was gracious with all of them, smiling and conversing with apparent ease, and each smile felt like a small wound. Alexander knew he was being irrational. She owed him nothing. One dance did not constitute an understanding. His interest in her, this unwelcome, unsettling attraction, was his burden to bear, not hers to reciprocate. Yet when Fairfax led her out onto the terrace, following the same path Alexander had taken with her the previous evening, he found himself setting down his untouched champagne and following. The terrace was less crowded than it had been the night before, with only a few couples taking the air. Alexander stationed himself in the shadows near the doors, watching as Fairfax and Eleanor stood at the balustrade, much as he and she had stood. He could not hear their conversation, but he could see Fairfax leaning close, could see the animation in his face as he spoke, could see Eleanor laughing at something he said. The jealousy that rose in him was black and bitter, all the more painful for being entirely unreasonable. He had no right to it. He had no right to her. He had spent the last 4 years cultivating his isolation, convincing himself that he was better off alone, that he was incapable of the kind of connection that others seemed to form so effortlessly. Now, watching another man make her smile, he felt the full cost of that isolation, the awareness that he had locked himself away so thoroughly that he no longer knew how to reach toward another human being, even when he wanted to, with an intensity that shocked him. "She is lovely, is she not?" The voice came from beside him, and Alexander turned to find Lady Pemberton, Eleanor's aunt, regarding him with shrewd eyes. She was an elderly woman, thin and upright, with the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she missed very little. "Miss Ashworth is striking," Alexander said carefully. "She is more than that, as I suspect you have already discovered." Lady Pemberton's tone was dry. "My niece has a rare quality of character, Your Grace. She is honest to a fault, intelligent beyond what society typically appreciates in women, and possessed of a compassionate heart that has been tested by considerable sorrow. She deserves a man who can appreciate those qualities." It was a warning, delicately delivered, but unmistakable. Alexander felt something in him bristle at the implication. That he was not such a man, even as he acknowledged the truth of it. "I am certain she will have many suitors from which to choose," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "Oh, she will have suitors aplenty," Lady Pemberton agreed. "Mr. Fairfax, for instance, has already expressed his admiration quite openly. He is young, enthusiastic, uncomplicated, the sort of man who would make any woman's life pleasant and easy." She paused, her eyes fixed on Alexander's face. "But I do not think my niece wants an easy life, Your Grace. She has traveled too far, seen too much, thought too deeply for that. She needs a man who will match her in depth, who will not be frightened by her intelligence or independence, who will value her for precisely what she is, rather than trying to reshape her into something more conventional." "And you believe I am such a man?" Alexander asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "I, who am noted throughout London for my coldness and my complete disinterest in marriage." "I believe," Lady Pemberton said quietly, "that you are a man who has been wounded and who has responded by building walls so high that you yourself can no longer see over them. But I also believe that my niece has somehow found a door in those walls, Your Grace, and that terrifies you." She laid a light hand on his arm. "The question is whether you will have the courage to open that door, or whether you will bolt it shut and condemn yourself to a lifetime of safety and solitude." She left him then, returning to the ballroom, and Alexander remained in the shadows, her words echoing in his mind. A door in his walls. The metaphor was apt. Eleanor had seen him, truly seen him, in a way no one else ever had, and the recognition had created a breach in his carefully maintained defenses. He could feel it widening with every moment he spent in her presence, every conversation they shared, every smile she bestowed upon him. It would be so easy to retreat, to close, himself off again, to return to the cold safety of isolation. He knew how to do that. He had perfected the art of it. But watching her now, seeing the way the moonlight touched her face as she listened to whatever foolish thing Fairfax was saying, Alexander felt something shift in him, a stubborn, irrational determination not to surrender without a fight. He did not know if he was capable of being the man she deserved. He suspected he was not. But the alternative, standing aside and watching her, give her warmth and intelligence and compassionate heart to someone like Fairfax, someone who would never appreciate the full measure of what he possessed, was suddenly unbearable. The realization frightened him more than anything had in years. When Eleanor and Fairfax returned to the ballroom, Alexander was waiting. He intercepted them with quiet authority, addressing Eleanor directly. "Miss Ashworth, I believe you promised me a second dance," he said, though no such promise had been made. "If you are not too fatigued." He saw the surprise in her eyes, followed by something else, a flicker of pleasure perhaps, or recognition of what he was doing. Fairfax looked disappointed, but could hardly object without appearing churlish. "I am not at all fatigued, Your Grace," Eleanor said, placing her hand on his offered arm. "I should be delighted." They moved onto the floor as another waltz began, and this time Alexander held her fractionally closer, feeling the warmth of her through the layers of silk and propriety. He should not be doing this, should not be allowing himself to feel what he was feeling, should not be staking a claim he had no right to make. But he was tired of should-nots, tired of the endless restrictions he had placed upon himself, tired of living in a prison of his own construction. "You did not promise me a second dance," Eleanor observed, her voice low and amused. "No," he admitted, "but I found I could not bear watching Fairfax monopolize your time any longer." She looked up at him, her grey eyes searching his face, and he made no effort to hide what he was feeling. Let her see. Let her know. He was done with concealment, at least for tonight. "Are you claiming a monopoly of your own, then?" she asked softly. "Would you object if I were?" "That depends," she said, "on whether your interest is genuine or merely a matter of pride. I have no desire to be a prize in some competition, Your Grace." He drew her incrementally closer. "Propriety be damned. My interest is entirely genuine, Miss Ashworth, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with Fairfax or any other man. It has to do with you, with your honesty, your intelligence, your refusal to perform the expected role. It has to do with the fact that you see me, truly see me, and do not turn away." He felt her breath catch, felt the slight tremor that ran through her. "And what is it that I see?" she whispered. "A man who is trying," he said, the words raw and honest in a way he had not expected. "Trying to be more than he has been, trying to find the courage to open a door he has kept locked for far too long, trying perhaps to become worthy of someone who deserves far better than what I have allowed myself to be." The music swirled around them, and in her eyes he saw understanding and something that might have been hope. She did not speak, but her hand tightened slightly on his, and the gesture said everything that needed to be said. They finished the dance in silence, but it was the silence of communion rather than awkwardness. When the final notes faded, Alexander led her from the floor, reluctant to release her hand but knowing he must. Fairfax was hovering nearby, clearly intending to claim her for the next dance, but Eleanor forestalled him with quiet courtesy. "Forgive me, Mr. Fairfax, but I find I am quite fatigued after all. I believe I shall retire for the evening." She glanced at Alexander, and in that glance he read both promise and challenge. Then she was gone, leaving him standing in the ballroom with his heart beating faster than it had in years, and the unsettling awareness that he had just committed himself to a course from which there might be no retreat. He did not sleep that night. He lay in the darkness of his room, listening to the house settle around him, and thought about doors and walls and the terrifying possibility of connection. He thought about his father, about the cold emptiness that had defined his life, about the choice that lay before him now, to repeat the patterns of the past or to risk everything in the hope of creating something different. By dawn, he had made his decision. He did not know if he would succeed. He did not know if he was capable of being what Eleanor deserved. But he would try, and in that trying perhaps he would discover whether redemption was possible for a man who had spent so many years believing himself beyond its reach. Boxing Day dawned with the snow that had been threatening for days finally. Beginning to fall, soft white flakes that transformed the grounds of Hartwell House into something from a fairy story. The guests gathered for breakfast in high spirits, exclaiming over the beauty of the snow and making plans for skating on the ornamental lake that lay beyond the formal gardens. Alexander descended late. Having spent the early morning hours in correspondence he could no longer postpone. Estate matters, business in London, the endless demands of his position, all had been neglected during these days at Hartwell House, and his steward's latest letter had contained several items requiring urgent attention. He had dealt with them perfunctorily, his mind elsewhere, impatient to be done with duty so that he might seek out Eleanor. He found her in the morning room, seated by the window with her ever-present book, though he noted that her eyes were not on the pages, but on the falling snow beyond the glass. She wore a morning dress of soft grey wool that somehow made her eyes appear even more luminous, and her dark hair was dressed simply without the elaborate arrangements favoured by most ladies. She looked, he thought, like herself, unpretentious, genuine, entirely unconcerned with impressing anyone. "Miss Ashworth," he said, approaching with something that felt dangerously like eagerness. "I had hoped to find you. I wondered if you might like to walk in the gardens despite the snow." She looked up, and he saw immediately that something was different. The warmth that had been in her eyes the previous evening had cooled, replaced by a careful politeness that felt like a door closing. His chest tightened with inexplicable dread. "I think not, Your Grace," she said quietly. "The snow is falling rather heavily, and I should not wish to catch cold." It was a reasonable objection, yet the tone in which it was delivered suggested it was merely an excuse. Alexander felt off balance, uncertain what had changed between last night and this morning. Perhaps later then when the snow has eased. Perhaps. But her voice held no conviction, and she returned her attention to her book in a clear dismissal. Alexander stood there for a moment, pride warring with confusion and a growing sense of something being terribly wrong. He was not accustomed to uncertainty in his dealings with others. He commanded, they obeyed. He withdrew, they pursued. He remained indifferent, and they respected that indifference. This woman, who had somehow breached his defenses, without apparent effort, now seemed intent on rebuilding walls between them, and he did not understand why. "Have I offended you in some way?" he asked, abandoning pride in favor of directness. "If so, I should like to know what I have done so that I might make amends." She looked up again, and this time he saw something like pain in her eyes before she masked it. "You have done nothing, Your Grace. I simply think it would be wise if we maintained a more appropriate distance. Our dance last evening was perhaps too particular. People have begun to talk, and I have no wish to be the subject of speculation." "And since when do you concern yourself with what people say?" The words came out more sharply than he intended, frustration bleeding through his customary control. "You told me yourself that you value honesty over pretense, that you have no patience for social games. Was that merely another performance, Miss Ashworth?" Colour rose in her cheeks, and he saw her spine stiffen. "Do not presume to lecture me about honesty, Your Grace. I've been nothing but honest with you from the beginning." "Then be honest now," he demanded, moving closer despite the impropriety of it, despite the presence of other guests in the room. "Tell me what has changed between last evening and this morning. Tell me why you are suddenly treating me as though I am a stranger." For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Then she closed her book with deliberate care and rose to face him, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes blazing with suppressed emotion. "Very well," she said, her voice low and tight. "Since you insist on honesty, I shall give it to you. This morning, at breakfast, I overheard a conversation between Mr. Fairfax and Lord Hartwell's nephew. They were discussing you, speculating about your sudden interest in me, wondering what game you were playing. And Mr. Fairfax, with great confidence, assured his companion that the Duke of Ravensmore would never seriously consider marrying someone of my station, that you were merely amusing yourself, that I should not mistake your attentions for genuine regard." Alexander felt cold fury rise in him, fury at Fairfax for his presumption, fury at himself for creating a situation where such speculation was possible. And you believed him? You believed that I was merely amusing myself? I believed, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly despite her obvious effort at composure, that Mr. Fairfax was saying aloud what everyone in this house is thinking, that the Duke of Ravensmore, who has rejected every eligible lady in London for the past decade, would hardly throw away his consequence on a nobody like me, that your interest, however flattering, is temporary and ultimately meaningless. That is not true, Alexander said, but even as he spoke the words, he realized how hollow they sounded. What assurance had he given her? What indication that his intentions were honorable? He had danced with her, conversed with her, allowed himself to feel something for her, but he had made no declaration, offered no promises. In the eyes of society, Fairfax was entirely correct in his assessment. Is it not? Eleanor's composure was fracturing now, pain leaking through the cracks. Then tell me, Your Grace, what are your intentions? Do you wish to court me? To marry me? Or are you simply indulging in the novelty of having found someone who interests you intellectually, someone who provides a pleasant diversion from the tedium of your usual society? It was the question he had been avoiding asking himself, the question that struck at the heart of his own confusion and fear. Did he wish to marry her? The thought had crossed his mind, impossible to ignore after the previous evening, but he had not allowed himself to examine it too closely. Marriage meant vulnerability, meant risking the kind of pain his mother had endured, meant opening himself to the possibility of becoming like his father, cold, cruel, destructive. Marriage meant admitting that he needed someone, that his carefully constructed independence was a lie. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat, and in that hesitation, he saw Eleanor's expression change from hope to something like resignation. I see, she said quietly. You do not know what you want. Or perhaps you do know, and simply lack the courage to admit it. She gathered her book and her shawl. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I have spent too many years watching my father pine for something he could never have again, to willingly become someone else's object of unfulfilled longing. If you cannot offer me certainty, then I must ask you to leave me in peace. Eleanor, Miss Ashworth, please. He reached for her hand without thinking, propriety forgotten in the urgency of not losing her. You do not understand. It is not a question of wanting. I do want. It is a question of whether I am capable of being what you deserve. She pulled her hand free, and the loss of that small contact felt catastrophic. Then that is your answer, Your Grace, and I respect it, even if it disappoints me. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears now, but her voice remained steady. I thank you for your honesty. I wish you well. She left the room before he could respond, and Alexander stood frozen, aware that something vital had just broken and uncertain whether it could be mended. Around him, the other guests continued their conversations, oblivious to the small tragedy that had just unfolded in their midst. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to find Lady Pemberton, regarding him with a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. You are a fool, Your Grace, she said bluntly. My niece offered you something rare and precious, and you allowed your fear to make you fumble it. I had hoped for better from you. I do not know how to be what she needs, Alexander said, the admission tasting like ashes. I do not know if I am capable of it. None of us knows until we try, Lady Pemberton replied, but refusing to try guarantees failure, does it not? She shook her head sadly. Eleanor has been hurt enough in her life, Your Grace. If you cannot commit to her fully, then you are right to let her go. But if you feel for her even a fraction of what I suspect you do, then your cowardice is the greater cruelty. She departed, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts and his mounting sense of having made a terrible mistake. He knew she was right. He knew that his hesitation, however well-intentioned, had wounded Eleanor in exactly the way she feared most, had made her feel like an amusement, a diversion, something less than worthy of genuine commitment. And he knew that unless he found a way to overcome his own fear, he would lose her completely. The realization should have spurred him to action. Instead, he felt paralyzed by the magnitude of what was being asked of him. To marry Eleanor meant more than simply taking a wife. It meant dismantling every defense he had constructed, meant trusting another person with the power to destroy him, meant risking the discovery that he was, indeed, his father's son, incapable of the kind of love that did not wound. He spent the rest of the day in avoidance, retreating to the library and pretending absorption in estate papers, while his mind churned uselessly through the same circular arguments. By evening, when the guests gathered for dinner, he had convinced himself that perhaps it was better this way, that Eleanor deserved someone whole and uncomplicated, someone like Fairfax who could offer her joy without the shadow of damage and doubt. It was only when he descended to dinner and saw her seated between Fairfax and the baronet from Shropshire, her face carefully bright as she conversed with them, that the full weight of his loss crashed down upon him. She was exactly as she had been before, gracious, intelligent, engaging, but the warmth that had been in her eyes when she looked at him was gone, redirected to others who had not failed her as he had. He made it through dinner through sheer force of will, responding mechanically to the conversation around him, while every fibre of his being was attuned to Eleanor's presence across the table. After the meal, when the company retired to the drawing-room for music and cards, he watched as Fairfax solicited her for a song, watched as she moved to the pianoforte with quiet grace, watched as her fingers drew beauty from the keys while her voice filled the room with a ballad about lost love and regret. The lyrics cut him like knives. She sang of chances not taken, of words left unspoken, of the bitter cost of pride and fear. And though her eyes never met his, though she seemed to sing to the room at large, Alexander knew with certainty that the song was meant for him, a farewell perhaps, or a final plea for courage he did not possess. When the song ended, the room erupted in applause. Fairfax thanked her with excessive enthusiasm, and she smiled and accepted the compliments with her usual grace. Alexander rose abruptly, unable to bear any more, and left the room without excuse or explanation. He found himself in the darkened library, standing before the fire, gripping the mantelpiece with both hands while his chest heaved with emotions he had suppressed for so long he had almost forgotten how to name them. Rage at himself, at his weakness, at the fear that had poisoned everything good he might have claimed, grief for what he had lost through his own cowardice, and underneath it all a terrible, aching need for the woman who had seen him and offered him redemption, only to have him turn away. The door opened behind him and he turned, hoping against hope that it might be Eleanor, that she had followed him, that there might yet be a chance to undo the damage he had done. But it was only Fairfax, slightly flushed from wine and triumph, regarding Alexander with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "So, Your Grace, are you quite well? You left rather abruptly." "I am perfectly well, thank you," Alexander said, his voice colder than the winter air outside. "Was there something you required?" "I merely wished to say—" Fairfax hesitated, then continued with the blunt honesty of the slightly drunk. "That is, I wanted you to know that I intend to ask Miss Ashworth to marry me before we leave Hartwell House. I thought, given your interest in her, that it would be only honourable to inform you of my intentions." Alexander felt something in him simply break. All the careful control, all the years of discipline and restraint, shattered like ice under a hammer blow. He moved before he thought, crossing the room in 3 strides, grabbing Fairfax by the collar and slamming him against the bookshelf with a violence that shocked them both. "You will not," Alexander said, his voice low and deadly, "presume to tell me of your intentions toward Miss Ashworth as though seeking my permission. You will not reduce her to an object over which we compete, and you will certainly not marry her, Fairfax, because she deserves infinitely better than a boy who can barely hold his wine and who mistakes genuine regard for a prize to be won." Fairfax stared at him, eyes wide with shock and fear. Your Grace, I meant no offence." Alexander released him abruptly, stepping back, horrified by his own loss of control. "Get out," he said, his voice shaking. "Get out before I do something I truly regret." Fairfax fled, and Alexander was left alone again with the wreckage of his composure and the terrible knowledge that he had just revealed, in the most brutish possible way, exactly how much Eleanor Ashworth meant to him. Too much. Far too much for safety, for sanity, for the careful life he had constructed. He sank into a chair and dropped his head into his hands, and for the first time since his father's death, Alexander Grenville, 6th Duke of Ravensmore, allowed himself to weep. Alexander, left Hartwell House the following morning, before most of the guests had risen. He made his excuses to Lord Hartwell, urgent business in London, matters requiring his immediate attention, and departed in the grey light of dawn, with snow still falling steadily from a leaden sky. He did not seek Eleanor out before leaving. He told himself it was for the best, that a clean break was kinder than prolonging the agony, that she would be better off without him. He told himself many lies during that cold journey back to London. His townhouse in Grosvenor Square welcomed him with the same elegant emptiness it always had. Perfectly appointed rooms that bore no trace of personality, halls that echoed with his solitary footsteps, fires lit by invisible servants in grates where no one gathered for warmth or companionship. It was, he thought bitterly, exactly what he deserved. He had built this life deliberately, had chosen isolation over risk, and now he would live with the consequences. The days that followed were grey and without distinction. Alexander attended to his business with mechanical efficiency, meeting with his steward and his solicitors, reviewing accounts and correspondence, making decisions about matters that seemed to matter less with each passing hour. He went to his club, sat in Parliament when required, fulfilled every social obligation with the same cold courtesy that had become his signature, and all the while he was aware of an absence, a hollow space where something vital had been and was no more. He did not allow himself to think of Eleanor. When memories surfaced, her voice, her direct grey eyes, the way she had looked at him with such clear-eyed understanding, he pushed them away, buried himself in work, in anything that might distract him from the pain of his own cowardice. It did not help. At night, lying sleepless in his bed, he would remember the warmth of her hand in his during their waltz, the honesty in her voice when she spoke to him, the promise that had been offered and rejected. 3 weeks after leaving Hartwell House, Alexander received an invitation to a ball being hosted by the Duchess of Pembroke. He almost declined. He had no appetite for society, no patience for the endless empty conversations, but something made him accept. Perhaps it was the faint hope that Eleanor might be there, that he might see her from across a crowded room and know that she was well. Perhaps it was simply that the loneliness had grown unbearable, and even empty company was preferable to the silence of his own thoughts. He attended the ball in evening blacks that seemed appropriate to his mood, arriving late and scanning the ballroom with an anxiety he would not have admitted to anyone. He did not see her immediately, and the disappointment was acute, a physical pain in his chest that made breathing difficult. Then he saw Lady Pemberton standing near the refreshment table, and his heart began to pound. He made his way to her side with as much casualness as he could muster, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the crush of guests before asking, with studied indifference, whether her niece was in attendance. Lady Pemberton regarded him with an expression that mingled pity and exasperation. "Eleanor is not here, Your Grace. She has returned to the country, to my estate in Gloucestershire." "I see." Alexander struggled to keep his voice level. "I hope she is well." "She is as well as can be expected," Lady Pemberton said tartly. "For a woman who has had her heart broken by a coward, too afraid of his own feelings to recognize genuine affection when it is offered to him." The words struck like a physical blow. Alexander flinched, unable to maintain his usual mask. "I did not mean to hurt her. I believed she would be better off." "You believed it would be easier to run away than to risk being hurt yourself," Lady Pemberton interrupted. "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending your retreat was motivated by concern for Eleanor's welfare. You were thinking only of yourself, Your Grace, of your own fear and your own pain, and in doing so, you inflicted considerable suffering on a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, except make the mistake of seeing something worthwhile in you." Each word was deserved, and Alexander accepted them without defense. "Is she truly heartbroken?" he asked quietly. "Or has she perhaps found consolation elsewhere?" "If you are asking whether Mr. Fairfax followed through on his intentions, the answer is yes. He proposed to her the day after you left Hartwell House." Lady Pemberton's eyes were sharp on his face, watching for his reaction. "She refused him, quite kindly but quite firmly. She also refused 2 other gentlemen who have since called upon her, both of excellent family and character. It seems that my niece, having once allowed her heart to become engaged, finds she cannot simply transfer her affections at will, despite the fact that the object of those affections has proven himself thoroughly unworthy. Relief and anguish warred in Alexander's chest. She had refused Fairfax. She had not moved on, had not simply replaced him with someone more willing, more whole. But she was suffering because of him, and that knowledge was almost worse than the thought of her marrying another. "What can I do?" he asked, abandoning all pretense of pride. "How can I make amends?" Lady Pemberton studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "Slightly. I am not certain you can, Your Grace. Eleanor is not the sort of woman who gives her trust lightly, and once broken, it is not easily mended. But if you are truly sorry, if you have truly discovered that your fear is less important than your feeling for her, then perhaps you might try actually telling her so, in person, with honesty and without reservation. And if she will not see me, then you will have your answer, will you not?" Lady Pemberton's voice was not unkind. "But I think you owe her at least the attempt, Your Grace. You owe her the truth you should have offered at Hartwell House." Alexander left the ball shortly after, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. To go to Eleanor would require admitting everything he had spent years denying, that he was capable of love, that he needed another person, that the emptiness inside him could not be filled by wealth or position or carefully maintained indifference. It would require making himself vulnerable in a way that terrified him more deeply than any physical danger could. Yet the alternative, continuing as he had been, living in this grey half-life without warmth or connection or hope, was no longer tolerable. Lady Pemberton was right. He owed Eleanor the truth, even if that truth came far too late to make any difference. He spent the next several days in preparation, putting his affairs in order with the same meticulous care he brought to all his undertakings. He met with his steward, ensured that his business in London could proceed without his immediate oversight, and made arrangements for an extended absence from town. He also did something he had never done before. He visited his mother's grave. The cemetery was cold and windswept, the headstones grey against greyer sky. Alexander stood before the marble monument that marked his mother's resting place and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to remember her as she had been when he was a child, gentle, kind, full of warmth, that his father had slowly extinguished. He remembered how she used to read to him in the evenings, how her voice would soften when she spoke of love and honor and all the things she wished for him. He remembered the light going out of her eyes year by year, until she had become a shadow in her own house, present but not truly alive. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, his words lost in the wind. "Sorry that I could not protect you. Sorry that I became so much like him in my determination not to be. Hurt as you were hurt. Sorry that it took me so long to understand that fear is its own kind of death." He stood there for a long time, letting the cold seep into his bones, and when he finally turned to leave, he felt something shift in him, a small loosening of the terrible weight he had carried for so long. His mother would have wanted him to be happy. She would have wanted him to love and be loved, and not repeat the mistakes that had destroyed her own life. The best honor he could give her, memory, was to try, truly try, to be different. 2 days later, Alexander departed London for Gloucestershire. The journey was long and uncomfortable, the road still treacherous with snow and ice, but he pushed forward with single-minded determination. He had wasted enough time in hesitation and fear. Whatever Eleanor's answer might be, he would hear it from her own lips, and he would speak the truth he should have spoken at Hartwell House. Lady Pemberton's estate, Ashwood Park, was smaller than Alexander's own holdings, but no less elegant. A graceful manor house set among rolling hills and ancient oaks, surrounded by gardens that, even in winter, possessed a stark beauty. He arrived in late afternoon, the winter sun already sinking toward the horizon, and was shown into a drawing-room by a butler who regarded him with the subtle disapproval servants reserved for gentlemen who had caused their mistresses distress. Lady Pemberton received him there, alone. Eleanor, he was told, was walking in the gardens and would be informed of his arrival. "You came," Lady Pemberton said, studying him with those sharp eyes. "I confess I was not entirely certain you would." "I could not do otherwise," Alexander replied. "Not after what you told me. Not after—" He paused, searching for words. "Not after I finally admitted to myself that my life without her in it is no life at all." Pretty words, Your Grace. But Eleanor will require more than words. She will require proof. Proof that you have truly changed, that you will not run at the first sign of difficulty or fear. I know. Alexander met her gaze steadily. I am prepared to offer whatever proof she requires. I am prepared to wait as long as necessary. I am prepared to accept her refusal, if that is her decision. But I must try. Surely you can understand that. Lady Pemberton's expression softened infinitesimally. I do understand, Your Grace. More than you perhaps realize. I was married once, you know, many years ago, to a man, much like you, proud, frightened of his own capacity for feeling, convinced that isolation was safer than connection. He died before we could truly find our way to each other, and I have regretted it every day since. She rose, moving to look out the window at the darkening gardens. I do not wish the same regret for Eleanor, or for you, but the choice must be hers. They waited in silence, and Alexander felt his anxiety building with each passing moment. What would he say to her? How could he possibly express the enormity of what he felt, the depth of his regret, the desperate hope that she might somehow find it in herself to forgive him? The door opened, and Eleanor entered, still in her outdoor things, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her dark hair slightly disheveled from the wind. She stopped short when she saw Alexander, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, pain, and a careful blankness that cut him more deeply than anger would have. Your Grace, she said, her voice carefully neutral. This is unexpected. Alexander rose, his heart pounding so hard he was certain both women must be able to hear it. Miss Ashworth, forgive the intrusion. I know I have no right to your time, but I wondered if you might allow me a few moments of conversation. There are things I need to say to you, things I should have said at Hartwell House. Eleanor looked at her aunt, who nodded slightly, and quietly excused herself from the room, leaving them alone. The silence stretched, taut and painful, until finally Eleanor moved to the window, her back to him, her arms wrapped around herself as though for protection. Why have you come? She asked quietly. What purpose can it possibly serve to revisit what is already finished? Because it is not finished, Alexander said, moving closer but not touching her, not daring to intrude on the space she had placed between them. Because I have spent the last month in a hell entirely of my own making, and because I finally understand that I was wrong. About everything. She turned to face him then, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears, and something that might have been anger. You were wrong. That is what you came all this way to tell me, that you have reconsidered, that perhaps I might be worth your attention after all. That is not enough, Your Grace. That will never be enough. I know, he said, and his voice broke on the words. I know it is not enough, but I am asking for the chance to explain, to make you understand why I failed you so terribly, and to promise you, to swear to you that I will never fail you in that way again. You cannot make such a promise, Eleanor said, but her voice was shaking now. You cannot know what you will do when you are frightened, when your past threatens to consume you, when the risk of feeling becomes too great. You are right, Alexander agreed. I cannot know with absolute certainty, but I can tell you that I have spent these weeks confronting everything I have tried so hard to avoid. My father's legacy, my mother's suffering, my own terror of becoming what he was. And I can tell you that the only thing more frightening than risking my heart is the prospect of living the rest of my life without you in it. He took a breath, steadying himself for what came next. Eleanor, I am not a good man. I am cold and proud, and damaged in ways I am only beginning to understand. I do not know if I am capable of being the husband you deserve. But I love you. I love you with a desperation that has unmade me completely, and if you will give me the chance, if you will allow me to try, I will spend the rest of my life learning how to be worthy of that love. The tears were falling now, streaming down her face, and Alexander felt his own eyes burning with the ache of emotions too long suppressed. He wanted to reach for her, to gather her into his arms and promise her everything would be well. But he held himself back, knowing that the next move must be hers. How can I trust you? She whispered. How can I believe that you will not run again the moment your fear becomes too great? You cannot, he said simply. Trust must be earned, and I have done nothing to earn yours. All I can offer is my word, and the promise that I will spend every day proving to you that I mean what I say. He paused, gathering his courage for the final admission. I need you, Eleanor, not as an ornament or a diversion, but as a partner, a companion, someone who sees me truly and loves me despite, or perhaps because of, all my flaws. I need you as I have never needed anything in my life, and I am finally brave enough to admit it. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then, slowly, Eleanor closed the distance between them, raising one hand to touch his face with infinite gentleness. I love you too, she said, her voice breaking. God help me, I love you too. And that terrifies me every bit as much as it terrifies you. Alexander caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin against his and the trembling that matched his own. Then let us be terrified together, he said. Let us risk everything, and perhaps discover that love is worth the fear it demands. And then there were no more words, only the two of them holding each other in the fading winter light, both weeping, both afraid, both choosing courage over safety and connection over the cold comfort of isolation. The evening settled over Ashwood Park with unusual quietness, as though the house itself sensed the significance of what was unfolding within its walls. Alexander and Eleanor remained in the drawing room long after the light had faded, sitting together on the sofa, with a careful distance still maintained between them. Not the distance of strangers, but the careful space of two people learning to trust again. Eleanor had stopped crying, though her eyes remained red-rimmed, and Alexander found himself unable to look away from her face. In the firelight, with her composure gently fractured and her heart visible in her expression, she was more beautiful than he had ever seen her. I need to understand, she said finally, her voice still unsteady. What changed? When I saw you at Hartwell House, you were so certain that you could not give me what I needed. What happened between then and now to alter that certainty? Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as he searched for the right words. Nothing changed, he said slowly. And everything changed. The facts remain the same. I am still damaged, still frightened, still uncertain of my capacity to be what you deserve. But I finally understood that running from those fears had not made me safer. It had only made me alone. He turned to look at her, meeting her steady grey gaze. When I left Hartwell House, I convinced myself it was for your benefit, that you would be better off with someone whole and uncomplicated, someone who could give you joy without the shadow of my past hanging over everything. But it was a lie I told myself to justify my cowardice. The truth was that I was protecting myself, not you. I was so afraid of becoming my father, of inflicting on you the same suffering he inflicted on my mother, that I chose to inflict a different kind of suffering instead. Your father, Eleanor said quietly. You have mentioned him before, but always obliquely. What did he do to make you fear yourself so much? It was the question Alexander had been avoiding, the wound he had never allowed anyone to examine. But if he was to have any hope of moving forward with Eleanor, he knew he must open that wound completely, must let her see the full extent of his damage and trust that she would not turn away. He was cruel, Alexander said, the words coming with difficulty. Not in any way that would be visible to society. He never raised his hand, never created public scandal. But he was cold, contemptuous, dismissive of anything that suggested weakness or sentiment. He married my mother for her dowry and her connections, and when she proved to be a woman of genuine feeling, rather than the decorative ornament he had expected, he set about systematically destroying her spirit. Eleanor made a small sound of distress, but Alexander continued, needing to finish now that he had begun. I watched him do it. I watched him reduce her from a vibrant, loving woman to a pale shadow who barely spoke above a whisper. I watched him mock her kindness, her warmth, her attempts to create a home rather than merely a showplace, and I watched her love for him, because she did love him, despite everything, slowly wither and die until there was nothing left but resignation and quiet despair. How old were you? Eleanor asked gently. It began when I was perhaps 8 or 9. By the time I was 15, she had given up entirely. She lived another 7 years in that state, going through the motions of life, without any real engagement with it. Alexander's voice hardened, and through it all my father seemed to take satisfaction in her defeat, as though her suffering was proof of his superiority, his strength. And you feared you might do the same to someone you married, Eleanor said, understanding dawning in her eyes. You feared you had inherited his capacity for cruelty. I know I have inherited it, Alexander said bleakly. I have felt it in myself, the cold anger, the desire to wound when I'm wounded. The retreat into contempt when genuine feeling becomes too dangerous. When I lost my temper with Fairfax, when I grabbed him and threatened him, I saw my father in that moment. I heard his voice in mine, and it horrified me. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his cold ones. May I tell you what I see? She asked. Not to contradict your fear, but to offer a different perspective. Alexander nodded, not trusting his voice. I see a man who recognized cruelty in himself and was horrified by it, Eleanor said carefully. Your father, from what you have described, felt no such horror. He took pleasure in his power over your mother, satisfaction in her suffering. But you were devastated by your own loss of control. You saw yourself clearly, and you hated what you saw. Is that supposed to be comforting? Alexander asked bitterly. That I am at least aware of my capacity for harm. It is supposed to be truthful, Eleanor corrected gently. Your father's cruelty came from a fundamental lack of empathy, a genuine inability to see your mother as a person deserving of respect and kindness. Your fear comes from too much empathy, from seeing all too clearly how you might hurt someone and being unable to bear the thought of it. They are not the same thing, Alexander. They are, in fact, opposite things. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice sent a shock of warmth through him. He turned to look at her, seeing in her eyes not condemnation but compassion, not fear but understanding. I want to believe that, he said quietly. I want to believe that awareness of the danger is enough to prevent it. But wanting is not the same as certainty. No, Eleanor agreed. It is not. But nothing in life comes with certainty, Alexander. I could marry the kindest, gentlest man in England and still risk heartbreak when he dies, or changes, or discovers that he does not love me as much as he thought he did. The question is not whether there is risk. There is always risk. The question is whether the possibility of joy is worth that risk. She shifted closer to him, still holding his hand. When I refused Mr. Fairfax, when I refused the others who called upon me, it was not because I was pining for you, though I will not deny I thought of you far more than was comfortable. It was because I realized that I could not settle for safety when I had glimpsed the possibility of genuine connection. You saw me, truly saw me, in a way no one else ever has. And I saw you. That kind of recognition is too rare to abandon simply because it frightens us. You should be more afraid, Alexander said, though his grip on her hand tightened. You should demand more assurance than I can give. Perhaps, Eleanor said, a hint of her usual dry humor returning to her voice, but I have discovered that I am not particularly good at doing what I should. I prefer to do what feels true, and this, you and I together, feels more true than anything I have experienced in my life. Alexander raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch. I do not deserve you, he said against her skin, but I will spend my life trying to become worthy of you. You already are worthy, Eleanor whispered. You simply need to believe it. They sat together in the firelight, and slowly, carefully, Alexander allowed himself to believe that perhaps redemption was possible after all, not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through the quiet courage of choosing connection over isolation, trust over fear, love over the cold safety of indifference. The door opened and Lady Pemberton entered, regarding them with satisfaction barely concealed beneath her usual tartness. I trust you have settled your difficulties. We are working toward it, Aunt, Eleanor said, a slight blush colouring her cheeks but her hand remaining firmly clasped in Alexander's. Good. Then you will not object to my informing you that dinner has been waiting this past hour, and cook is threatening mutiny if we do not come to table immediately. She fixed Alexander with a pointed look. You will be staying, I assume, Your Grace. We have guest rooms prepared. If Miss Ashworth will permit it, I would like to stay for some days, Alexander said, looking to Eleanor for confirmation. There is much we need to discuss, and I do not wish to rush this conversation simply because propriety dictates I return to London. Propriety has never particularly concerned me, Eleanor said with a small smile. Stay as long as you wish. The days that followed were unlike anything Alexander had experienced. He and Eleanor fell into a rhythm of long conversations and comfortable silences, walks through the winter gardens and evenings by the fire with books and music and the occasional company of Lady Pemberton. They spoke of their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. Alexander found himself revealing things he had never told another living soul: his loneliness at university, his terror when his father died, and he realized he had no idea how to be a duke who was also a decent human being. His years of deliberate isolation and the slow realization that safety was just another word for prison. Eleanor matched his honesty with her own, speaking of her mother's death and her father's grief, of the years of wandering through Europe feeling untethered from any real home, of her fear that she was too independent, too unconventional, too difficult to ever find genuine companionship. And as they spoke, the careful distance between them gradually diminished until they could sit together without that space, until Alexander could put his arm around her shoulders or she could lean her head against his chest without either of them flinching from the intimacy. It was on the fourth evening of his stay that Alexander finally gathered the courage to make his proposal formal. They were in the music room, Eleanor at the pianoforte playing something soft and melancholy, while Alexander listened from his chair by the window. When the music faded, he rose and crossed to her, taking her hands and drawing her to her feet. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart, "I came here intending to ask you to marry me, but I find I must first ask you something else." She looked up at him, questioning. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. "Truly forgive me, not just the specific failure at Hartwell House, but all the years I spent building walls that kept everyone out, including myself? Can you forgive the fact that I will undoubtedly fail you again in smaller ways, that I will sometimes retreat into coldness when feeling becomes too much, that I am a damaged man who will require patience and understanding far beyond what should be asked of you?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were gentle tears, soft with compassion. "There is nothing to forgive," she said quietly. "We are all damaged, Alexander. We all carry wounds that shape how we love and how we fear. The question is whether we can be damaged together, whether we can offer each other grace when we fail, whether we can choose each other again and again despite our imperfections." "Then choose me," Alexander said, and now his own eyes were burning. "Choose me, knowing everything you know about me, all my flaws and fears and failures. Choose me and let me choose you, and let us build something together that is stronger than either of us could build alone." He released one of her hands to withdraw a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the stone the deep grey blue of a winter sky. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "The only member of my family who showed me genuine kindness when I was a child. She died when I was 10, but I remember her telling me that someday I would find someone who made me brave. I think she would have liked you very much." Eleanor looked at the ring, then at his face, and the smile that broke across her features was like sunrise after a long night. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. Yes to choosing you and being chosen, and building something new together. Yes to risk and fear and the possibility of joy. Yes, Alexander. Always yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. Then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her, with all the pent-up longing and relief and desperate gratitude of a man who had been lost, and now, finally, was found. They remained at Ashwood Park for another week, making plans and sending announcements, and gradually allowing themselves to believe in the future they were creating. Alexander sent to London for his mother's jewels, which he gave to Eleanor with the wish that she might wear them with more joy than his mother ever had. Eleanor showed him the notebook she had kept during her travels, observations and sketches and small essays about the places she had seen and the people she had met, and allowed him to understand the depth of her intelligence and the breadth of her compassion. It was on their final evening before returning to London that Eleanor brought up the one topic they had carefully avoided. "What will society say?" she asked, as they walked through the gardens in the twilight. "About you. Marrying someone of my station, someone without significant fortune or powerful connections." Alexander stopped, turning to face her. "They will say whatever they wish to say. Some will call it eccentric. Others will suggest I have lowered myself. A few will speculate about secret motives or hidden scandals. None of it will matter. It may matter to you when you are forced to endure their speculation," Eleanor said quietly. "I would not have you come to resent me because I damaged your reputation." "My reputation," Alexander said dryly, "is that of a cold, arrogant recluse who cares for nothing but his estates and his consequence. If marrying you damages that reputation, then I consider it an improvement." He took her hand, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I will not pretend that society's opinion means nothing to me. I have been trained my entire life to consider it. But I have finally learned that there are things that matter more. You matter more. Our happiness matters more. And if the price of that happiness is enduring some gossip and speculation, I will pay it gladly." She searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, and finding none. "Then I suppose we shall face it together," she said softly. "Together," he agreed, and kissed her there in the garden as the first stars appeared above them. They returned to London at the end of January, and the announcement of their engagement created exactly the stir Alexander had anticipated. The gossip papers speculated endlessly about his motives, about Eleanor's background, about whether the Duke of Ravensmore had finally succumbed to some form of madness. But they also noted with some surprise that His Grace appeared almost content, was seen smiling in public, was observed dancing with his betrothed at several balls, and generally seemed to have shed the cold remoteness that had characterized him for so many years. The wedding took place in March, in the private chapel at Ravensmore, with only close family and friends in attendance. Eleanor wore ivory silk and the Ravensmore sapphires, and when she walked down the aisle toward where Alexander stood waiting, he felt his throat tighten with the enormity of what he was receiving. Not just a wife, but a companion, a partner, someone who had looked into his darkness and chosen to bring light. They spoke their vows in steady voices, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Alexander kissed her with a tenderness that surprised them. This was not the end of their story, he knew. There would be difficulties ahead, moments when his old fears would resurface, times when Eleanor's independence would clash with the expectations of his position. They would argue, would hurt each other in small ways, would have to choose each other again and again. But as he looked at his wife, his Eleanor, and saw the love and trust and stubborn courage in her eyes, Alexander understood that he had finally found what he had been searching for. Without knowing, he searched. Not perfection, not safety, not the absence of fear or pain, but something infinitely more valuable, the presence of another human being who saw him completely and loved him anyway. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Christmas came again, as it always did, and Alexander found himself once more in a house filled with guests and celebration. But this year, everything was different. This year, Eleanor sat beside him at breakfast, her hand occasionally brushing his beneath the table. This year there was warmth and laughter in the ancient halls of Ravensmore. This year, when he woke on Christmas morning and turned to see her sleeping peacefully beside him, her dark hair spread across the pillow and her face soft with contentment, Alexander Grenville finally understood what all those hymns and carols had been singing about: redemption, grace, the possibility of transformation, love that cast out fear. He had found it, against all odds and expectations, and he would hold on to it, hold on to her for the rest of his life with gratitude and humility and the fierce determination of a man who had been given a second chance and knew exactly how precious, how rare, how absolutely miraculous such chances were. The morning light touched Eleanor's face and she stirred, opening her grey eyes to find him watching her. She smiled, that transforming smile that had first captured his attention in a crowded ballroom a year ago, and reached for his hand. "Happy Christmas," she whispered. "Happy Christmas," Alexander replied and kissed her, and knew that he was finally truly home.